Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your host, Joanne.
And on today's show, August 1st, 2017, we interview Tim Shorrock, an author, investigative journalist, and commentator on U.S. foreign policy on the situation in North Korea. Here is that interview.
Tim grew up in Japan and Korea, and he was recently in South Korea for an extended work visit. He's the author of the popular book Spies for Hire, and you can find Tim's work at The Nation, at News Tapa, the Korea Center for Investigative Reporting, many other media outlets, and also at his website, timshorrock.com. Welcome to the show, Tim. Why don't you tell us what you've been working on?
Well, actually, what I'm working on right now is a story looking at what happened to the previous agreements the U.S. had with North Korea, starting with the 1994 agreed framework that Clinton worked out through the intervention of Jimmy Carter, who, by going to Pyongyang, helped stop a war that the U.S. was going to launch against North Korea for leaving the nuclear proliferation treaty and starting to build nuclear weapons. That was the first major nuclear crisis. And a lot of times when this agreement that was reached in October 94, where the North Koreans suspended their nuclear program, ended their nuclear program, and in return the U.S. promised to end its hostile policy and move toward full economic and political normalization. And the U.S. also agreed to supply them with fuel oil as well as 2 light water reactors to compensate for the lost fuel they would have from closing their reactors. And so a lot of times when this agreement is talked about in the media, like CNN, for example, like I've heard John King on CNN say this like 4 or 5 times. We signed an agreement with North Korea and they broke it the next day. That's utter bullshit. It's a complete lie and a distortion of what happened. The North Koreans actually kept to the agreement. The agreement didn't really fall apart until 2003, which was as a result of a unilateral action by the Bush administration. But actually, the fuel oil was supplied until 2006. But what these people don't talk about is that for 10 years, North Korea froze its production of plutonium and nuclear weapons. 10 years as a result of this agreement. And, that they were negotiating, very detailed aspects of this, such as, how much oil would go to which production plant. And these were very, very involved discussions by U.S. and North Korean, both diplomats and all kinds of advisors, energy advisors who are working to implement this agreement. And for the North Koreans, the most important part of this agreement in 94 was the U.S. ending the hostile policy. And that's still their goal, their aim. On July 4th, when they tested this ICBM missile, just barely a month ago, in their statement about it, they said, at the very end, until the U.S. agrees to, I'm not quoting exactly, but this is basically what they said. They said, until the U.S. agrees to end its hostile policy toward the DPRK, we will not negotiate our nuclear weapons and missiles. We will not negotiate.
Now, Tim, just for clarification, when you say the hostile policy, for people who don't know a lot about this, there was obviously the Korean War. And I think it's technically, correct me if I'm wrong, we're still technically at war with North Korea on paper, or is the hostile policy something separate from ongoing war or whatever posture we're taking at this moment? Is there a difference?
Well, they see it as, ending the state of war and moving toward an armistice is something, moving toward a peace agreement, transforming this armistice that's still in place to a peace agreement, has been their proposal on the table for about 4 or 5 years now. But when they're talking about the hostile policy back then, and as they still are now. They're talking about, removing all sanctions, not pointing nuclear weapons at them, even though George Bush Sr. pulled nuclear weapons out of South Korea and lots of other countries, tactical nuclear weapons in 1991. Of course, there's nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed ships and planes all around the region that can easily, reach Korea. And the U.S. has never given up its nuclear first strike. It's never abandoned saying it would launch a first strike under certain circumstances. So they're talking about, what I mentioned earlier, which was full political and economic normalization, and ending the state of enmity, ending this enmity between the two countries. So like in '94, it was critical to them because, just a few years earlier, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and along with it had gone, the whole Eastern Bloc had collapsed, and that was now North Korea's natural economic partners and trading partners. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost a lot of their fuel oil, which the Soviets were giving them, at a very low price. And so this was a very crushing blow. But they've always been sort of independent of the very big socialist powers, communist powers, such as the Soviet Union and China. They've always had, disputes with them along the way over their economic development, over their military. So they've always been, they consider it this Juche philosophy.
Yeah, right. Juche. I was going to ask that. Is that the kind of, I understand, and you please correct me, that it's kind of like, or translates to up yours. Is that wrong, or is that?
It's more like Stalinism in one country. They're developing their economy in one country, not being dependent on other countries for, a heavy industry or anything. Just developing everything internally, and being a completely independent player. Especially this was when China and the Soviet Union were having major disputes during the 60s and 70s. But the point is that at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were trying to open up to their economy to the world, and they wanted to expand trading relations. They understood that the only way they would be able to survive would be able to expand their trade with non-communist countries outside of China. And the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc markets were not available anymore. So they were looking to sort of reach out and to have normal relations with the countries around them, and with the United States in particular. And so that was what was meant by ending the hostile policy. And they will, like I said, they still say this in their communications, in their official releases about their missile tests. So anyway, this agreement held for quite some time. I mean, I've been able to trace, say, Colin Powell as Secretary of State saying they were keeping the agreement as late as 2003, for late as 9 years after this agreement was signed. But what happened with the 94 agreement is instructive, because it was signed in October, and in November, Newt Gingrich led the Republican Party to victory to take the Congress for the first time since the 1940s, right? And one of the first things that the Republicans did when they took over, and especially Gingrich did, and people like McCain did, was attack the Clinton agreement with North Korea as appeasement and a sellout. And so they immediately began, saying that we have to overturn this agreement, and and they began to, although the agreement did not need congressional verification, it wasn't like a treaty that the Senate has to approve. Congress still had to approve spending for the fuel oil and other aspects of the agreement that the U.S. signed with North Korea. And after the, in the period between when they took over in late '94, for the next couple of years, over time, the North Koreans are smart enough. They know that the U.S. government has three branches, and that there's an executive, and there's a Congress, and there's also courts. But they knew that Congress is an important part of the U.S. government, and so here you had leading members of one branch of the U.S. government saying this agreement is not worth the paper it's printed on. And the Republicans, slowed money down. The administration would have to scramble to come up with the funds to pay for the fuel oil and this kind of thing. But by 1996, 1997, the North Koreans were beginning to complain to American visitors and these people that would former diplomats and others, academics who would go visit them. They were saying, hey, we kept our side of the agreement, but the U.S. isn't keeping its side of the agreement. And by the late 90s, 97, 98, U.S. intelligence began picking up evidence that they were buying centrifuges. They were buying equipment to process uranium. And in other words, so they, in part of the 94 agreement, they canceled their hard water Soviet reactors, which it was easy to reprocess that into plutonium, and they were buying light water reactors that it was harder to do. And so, by late 96, 97, they were complain that the agreement wasn't being kept on the U.S. side. And then U.S. intelligence picked up that they were, going to Pakistan and other countries to buy equipment for centrifuges that they could use to process uranium and do that route to making the nuclear bomb.
Oh, were they in the AQCon? Were they part of the AQCon network?
Absolutely, yeah. He was the guy who helped them with this stuff. But as a former U.S. diplomat pointed out to me the other day, the U.S. also went plutonium and uranium when it made its bombs. Right, the first bomb, Hiroshima bomb, was plutonium, and the other, the Nagasaki bomb was uranium processed in Richland, Washington. So this is like what countries do when they develop nuclear weapons. So they were technically they were breaking the agreement, but U.S. intelligence knew about this by the late 1990s. And then the missiles were not part of the agreed framework. So they were advancing on the missiles in the late 1990s too. And in 1998, the Clinton administration, Secretary of Defense William Perry was named sort of special ambassador for North Korea. And he opened up negotiations with them. While this agreed framework was proceeding and both sides were basically keeping to it, Clinton started negotiating with them on missiles, on minimizing their missile program. And by this time they still had not developed a nuclear weapon, and they only had fired about 2 or 3 missiles. It was very crude at that point. And at the end of the Clinton administration, 1999, 2000, as Wendy Sherman, who was one of the State Department negotiators, put it, the U.S. and North Korea were tantalizingly close to an agreement. And basically the agreement was that they had reached in principle was North Korea would end all missile production and testing and would ship any kind of nuclear material out of the country. But the most important thing was they were going to suspend all their missile production. And they were, Bill Clinton was almost ready to go there to North Korea because Secretary of State Albright went there in 2000 and to prepare the way for Bill Clinton to go. And this would have been, sort of the cap on the whole agreement. And this was to them the penultimate agreement where, the U.S. dropped its hostile policies and they would agree, to not have missiles and not have nuclear weapons in return for peace with the U.S., basically. Bill Clinton never got to North Korea because of the Gore-Bush election standoff, when the Supreme Court was hearing it. And right. his advisors didn't think Clinton should leave the country. But, it's important to remember that I think it was in 2000 that at the time, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, was the leader of North Korea. And his number 2 guy, this very high-ranking general, actually visited Bill Clinton in the White House. So that was sort of like the peak of U.S.-North Korean relations, if you will, 2000. But then, of course, we know what happened with Gore and Bush. And, Bush came in and his Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, came in with all these neocons. And one of the things Rumsfeld had been working on throughout the 90s was, remember, he was the chairman of this Commission on Ballistic Missiles, right? And they came out right before the election with this big report saying rogue states, this is the first, when this term really came into vogue, rogue states like North Korea and Iran are moving quickly to develop missiles, and we have to do everything we can to stop this. And Bush and Cheney, especially Cheney, came in saying, forget this agreed framework. This we can't talk with North Korea. And so then, they came with this attitude. And then, 2002, at this time, South Korea had a fairly progressive president, Kim Dae-jung, who was the first person to launch what he called the Sunshine Policy. And, he actually met with Kim Jong-il and went to North Korea, signed agreements with them. But he was really pushing for a reconciliation and an end to the hostility himself and pushing the U.S. to negotiate. But he went to visit George Bush early on in Bush's term, and Bush said in public, in front of Kim Dae-jung, contradicted his Secretary of State, Colin Powell, from a few hours before and said, I don't trust Kim Jong-il. We can't negotiate with him. And from then on, that's when the agreement really took a turn. And it was in that October 2002 that Bush sent. So anyway, going back to where the U.S. intelligence had found out about buying material to make uranium, to enrich uranium, the intelligence knew about this for a couple of years, but they didn't think it was a violation, nor was this uranium production. It wasn't in place. They just bought equipment to process uranium, so it wasn't like a strategic threat or anything like that. It's, a national security threat, because they didn't have the facility. Bush sent this guy, James Kelly, who was a low-ranking assistant secretary of state. And he came in with the evidence that they were moving toward a uranium bomb, and that they were going to reprocess uranium. And he went there with marching orders. I've talked to people that were in the State Department at the time and who were, part of the whole process. And they said he was given zero flexibility to negotiate. So he was just told to go to Pyongyang, read them the red line. You've done this agreement is crap, and we're pulling out. And that's what they did. And so within a few months of that trip, the Bush administration had said the agreed framework is no more because they've done this uranium program. And they began, and it was at that point that North Korea said, okay, they never said that they were building this uranium facility, but they said they had the right to do it, right. But they never owned up to it. But at that point they said, okay. And then they started opening up the reactor they had shut down before, and they started moving toward reprocessing and, making plutonium, for bombs.
Tim, real quick, is this for a timeline? 2002, is this after, or the agreement falls apart after or before the Axis of Evil speech in 2002?
It's actually, during. So like,
okay.
So Bush makes this speech. Actually, he made the speech after Kelly, went to Pyongyang. So Kelly goes there in October 2002, gives them the U.S. word, look, you're doing this. If you don't stop this, we're pulling out. North Korea, doesn't admit to it, but they say, actually in the meeting, they offered to put it all on the table. They said, okay, well, we're fine. We'll talk about, our right to have uranium processing. But Kelly's marching orders were so, narrow that he was not even allowed to listen to any proposals from them. And so they didn't take it. The U.S. could have said, well, okay, well, we'll talk about this, but they didn't. And in fact, in Condoleezza Rice's memoirs of this time, she even admits that his marching orders were so narrow that the U.S. lost an opportunity to shut down their program. She even admits it. And when Hillary Clinton ran for president in 2008, she also said that this uranium program was just a bogus reason to shut down to cancel the agreement. So it's not any kind of radical idea to say that, Bush made a very serious mistake by using this uranium to shut down the agreement. After it broke down, they started, going back to reprocessing and building a nuclear weapon. And they finally, exploded a nuclear weapon in 2006, their first test. But they were still holding, while they were negotiating with the Clinton administration, they imposed on themselves a moratorium on their missile testing. And by the time of their first nuclear weapon, they still had not broken that moratorium. So they did this nuclear test, the first one. They finally, got enough plutonium to make a bomb, and they exploded it. And 3 weeks later, after their first bomb test, is when George Bush approved reopening direct talks with North Korea, which I think is kind of hilarious considering what's going on today. Like it's all this talk of red lines and everything, right? Well, here they are. Here they blew up, tested a nuclear weapon, and Bush still opened negotiations with them. And so then they started. The negotiations were during that time. All this time, sometimes completely unrelated to the policy, the Treasury or State Department was doing these sanctions, partly driven by what was in law from Congress, but putting sanctions on North Korea for like developing, getting missile parts or selling certain things to Syria or Iran, this kind of thing. So there was always these sanctions going on. Sometimes, like I said, unrelated. And so, finally, when Bush opened negotiations with them, it was over this. They had shut down this North Korean accounts in this bank in called Bank something Del Asia, Banco Delta Asia, and they had frozen all North Korean hard currency accounts. And they finally reached an agreement on that. And they started moving toward, this is when the 6-party talks began that involved China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, U.S., North Korea. And these talks actually, went pretty far, but those talks over time also broke down over similar kinds of disputes. And so, you can't really say, well, North Korea broke it right away or North Korea broke it later. I mean, the fact is the U.S. broke part of the agreement itself. And so both sides, I think it's very clear for their own reasons, broke these various agreements. And so like, by the end of the Bush administration, I mean, I have this great quote. Here from this article. There's this guy I've been talking to, Leon Segal, who's in New York, who's been in what they call these track 2 negotiations with North Korea, where former U.S. diplomats go. Like he says, when President Bush took office, North Korea, thanks to diplomacy, had stopped testing longer-range missiles. It had less than a bomb's worth of plutonium and was verifiably not making more. 6 years later, as a result of Washington's broken promises and financial sanctions, it had 7 to 9 bombs worth, had resumed longer-range test launches, and felt free to test nuclear weapons. And all this time, the U.S. had been doing all this, various kind of military pressures and economic pressures. And Segal says the strategy of pressure, had failed. And so then, even after these negotiations broke down, North Korea was still putting out proposals for, a peace treaty, different things like that. And then, by the end of the Bush administration, they were still in negotiation, and there were still, negotiations to be picked up by the Obama administration. But, Obama was not really, his focus was much more on Iran, but also even though he said during the election that he would talk to North Korea, he said he'd talk to Iran, which he did, but he also said he would talk to North Korea as well. He didn't. And his advisors were pretty hardline themselves. And, like when he came to power, one of the first things they did was they launched a rocket that they said they were trying to put a missile they were trying to put a satellite in space, which actually they were trying to do. And at one point they did. But because this violated the agreements on missiles, there more sanctions were put on, and the UN came out against that. So then, under Obama, they continued to test, and then they also tested more nuclear weapons. And
right.
and there was no attempt to negotiate with Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un during Obama period. I mean, Kim Jong-un became I forget his term exactly, but he after his father died in 2011, and then he became the power center within a few weeks after that. But Obama policy was basically they just they call it strategic patience, right? They were basically hoping that North Korea would collapse on its own weight, and that would defuse the situation. They had no policy really.
Is that the grand strategy here, that North Korea? Because it seems like the hardliners' view, which I'm trying to decipher given the history you're laying out, is they don't seem to have an end game other than, well, maybe this will be like 1991 again, and they're just going to collapse. Is that the hope?
It's never even come close to collapse.
Right.
I mean, there's been since I've been reporting on Korea since the late 70s. I can't tell you how many articles I've read about North Korea's pending collapse. I mean, it's just like this is people say it all the time. There's with no proof or anything. I mean, people who write about this North Korea, most of them don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea what about Korean history, North Korean history. But it's got a structure that is not anywhere close to collapse. I mean, there's changes that go on within the structure. Of course, and lots of them lately have been economic changes because they're sort of central planning kind of collapsed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they had a few years of terrible, floods and starvation, and they had to really revamp. They shifted to allowing much more private markets and this kind of thing. There's been a lot of social changes within the structure, but it's not anywhere near like any kind of like revolutionary situation, even though you have high-level defections. Besides, it's ridiculous to base a negotiating strategy on the hope that, or not, just to base a strategy on the hope that the other people go away. It's stupid.
It's a Hail Mary pass is what it always seems like when I hear it. Like, oh, don't worry, we're going to cut off the coal. Now, Trump's talking about we want China to cut off coal shipments, and that'll collapse the regime. Or we're going to we're not going to give them food anymore. They're going to starve out, and then they'll negotiate. But it looks like, given the history, they've sort of built a system that, at least for the elite, they'll survive. I mean, it's kind of a Marshall society. Is that a read on it? That's fair.
Yeah, very much so. Marshall society is a good word for it. And this is not to approve their structure or their society or the extremely authoritarian nature of their state. It's just looking at reality. And the fact is that North Korea, as suffered terribly during the Korean War. It was completely wiped out by the U.S. bombing. There was nothing left to bomb. There was no targets left. It was rubble. It was just destroyed, flattened by U.S. bombers. And they built, a society on top of that, despite this terrible, bombing that happened, the destruction that happened. But they certainly remember that, and they know that they've been under, U.S. nuclear, until 91, there was tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, and they've been surrounded by U.S. nuclear weapons and, massive military, the alliances with Japan and South Korea, not to mention Australia and other countries. There's this huge, structure of bases that surround them. And so, and so then, during Obama, also Obama's response to some of the tensions was to, increase these bilateral military exercises the U.S. has with South Korea. And these began to be really stepped up under Obama. And, that's not just defensive exercises. They practice, what they call, decapitation of the North Korean leadership. They practice, invading North Korea. They practice regime change. They practice, South Korea coming in, taking over North Korea. That's what these exercises practice. And so for the last 3 or 4 years and under Obama, the North Korean side kept saying, we would like to, we'll suspend our nuclear program if you will ratchet down these or end these exercises.
Is that the main thing that they want right now? Actually, this is something I wasn't aware of, and maybe it's not accurate, but these annual exercises where they practice invading and decapitating, North Korea has to respond to each one of those because each time it could be a real invasion.
Right.
And is it true that these are timed in such a way that they take resources away from the agricultural sector? And this is part of the reason why North Korea has such a hard time feeding its own population.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think the military exercises themselves, have that effect, except for the fact that, clearly, to keep up, they have to pour lots of money into their military. I mean, they have an enormous military force for a country that's small, but they justify it by what they're faced with. I mean, they're faced not only with, the U.S., the most powerful military the world has ever seen, but they also are up against, South Korea. Military is certainly quite well developed as well, as is Japan's. And these countries are now in a trilateral military alliance. So it does, of course, it diverts a ton of money from their civilian economy. But they have this line now that's been in place since the time of Kim Jong-il, which is called the Byungjin line, which is that their nuclear development and economic development go together. They're part of the same parcel. And that's the way they're going to develop their economy, was to develop their military first. I mean, it's kind of like what the U.S. did in the 50s, really. I mean, our economy was certainly dominated by military production.
And the federal highway system, right? That was for military resources.
Highways, I mean, the Boeing 747 came out of the B-52. I mean, all these things, look at all DARPA, all these, things that are coming into common use, like the internet, come out of military spending. So, right. It's certainly not a crazy idea.
Could you speak to this? People need to understand about what North Korea's built up militarily is. There's pretty much no scenario, even if the U.S. used nuclear weapons, there'd be a lot of people, but there's really no scenario where the U.S. and South Korea and Japan could invade and that North Korea would not destroy a good portion of South Korea, particularly Seoul, because they have the artillery, right? Don't they have one of the largest artillery arrangements in the world? So even if they were able to do a decapitation strike, if it wasn't, even a thorough one, they would still level Seoul, into South Korea, right? Seoul would be gone, which is a city of multiple millions of people, correct? Or is that a bad read?
No. Seoul is, 30 kilometers south of the DMZ, and there is, thousands of artillery, conventional weapons just north of the DMZ, right. which are aimed at Seoul, of course, and they're aimed at, U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan as well. So, military people in the Pentagon understand this. And that's why they keep saying, a war is not, what we want. This is Secretary of Defense Mattis, has been saying this over and over again. They want diplomacy, not war. And people in the military know what a terrible thing another Korean war would be. And how many, South Koreans would die by the tens of thousands, but so would Americans.
Yeah.
So we do a preemptive strike on their nuclear facilities or something like that. they just hit back by launching, conventional weapons. And they, these missiles they have, they can go pretty far now. They can't. There's no evidence that they've been able to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and put it on top of these ICBMs, but they can put other weapons on those kind of missiles. So they have a formidable military force, and I think what they're actually, they say, as I mentioned before, in everything they talk about, they'll negotiate, they'll talk about their nuclear program, but they want the U.S. to end its hostile policy. And so they're talking about ending, sanctions and going back to this formulation of full diplomatic, full normalization at some point. But I think they want, a couple of years ago, they began talking more about having a peace treaty to end this, to move from the armistice to a full-fledged peace treaty. And, that's actually the last time they made that proposal. They said they would, put their missiles in moratorium if they would open talks on ending a peace treaty. And Obama administration just, didn't even respond, just flatly rejected it, publicly. Didn't even explore it or in any kind of way.
The Trump administration is taking the same stance. Nikki Haley just said, there's no more time for talks. Trump is taking the same line about, all the previous negotiations failed and we have to take action. And this is probably a good time to bring up what Lindsey Graham said this morning, because for anybody who didn't hear it, you really got to hear this.
The only way they're going to change if they believe there's a credible threat of military force on the table. The Chinese are miscalculating Trump and so are the North Koreans. He's got to choose between homeland security and regional stability. Japan, South Korea, China would all be in the crosshairs of a war if we started one with North Korea. But if they get a missile, they can hit California, maybe other parts of America.
But every military expert says there is no good military option.
They're wrong. There is a military option to destroy North Korea's program and North Korea itself. He's not going to allow President Trump the ability of this madman to have a missile to hit America. If there's going to be a war to stop him, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. They're not going to die here. And he's told me that to my face. And that may be provocative, but not really. When you're President of the United States, where's your allegiance lie? To the people of the United States. This man, Kim Jong-un, is threatening America with a nuclear-tipped missile. President Trump doesn't want a war. The Chinese can stop this. But to China, South Korea, and Japan, Donald Trump is not going to allow this missile threat
Just to be
mature.
clear, are you saying it's okay to use a military option that immediately endangers the lives of millions of people in that region?
I'm saying it's inevitable unless North Korea changes, because you're making our president pick between regional stability and homeland security. He's having to make a choice that no president wants to make. They've kicked the can down the road for 20 years. There's no place else to kick it. There will be a war with North Korea over their missile program if they continue to try to hit America with an ICBM. He has told me that. I believe him. And if I were China, I would believe him too, and do something about it. You can stop North Korea militarily or diplomatically. I prefer the diplomatic approach, but they will not be allowed to have a missile to hit America with a nuclear weapon on top. And to allow them to do that is really abandoning homeland security.
Okay, now that policy, if I understand it, is basically saying the minute the U.S. intelligence believes North Korea has the capacity, not the intention, the capacity to hit the western coast of the United States with a missile that could carry a nuclear payload, then U.S. will strike first with either a military invasion or a nuclear weapon. Now, that to me sounds like a crazy doctrine. And given the way the dynamics are working right now, it guarantees a war, if that's the doctrine. Although with Trump and with Lindsey Graham laying that out, maybe that is a doctrine. Tim?
Well, it's real insanity when you just write off the potential deaths of 1 million or more people. I mean, it's astonishing, really, when you consider the fact that there are 30,000, there's 26,000 American soldiers in South Korea that could be wiped out in an instant a war began. And there are 70,000 American soldiers in Japan. We're talking about tens of thousands of Americans, not to mention, millions of Koreans on both sides of the DMZ. So a man who talks like this is not sane. This is not an approach that anybody embraces that has any kind of, sense of humanity. But
the trigger is what's confusing me. The statement Trump has made, and I don't think Senator Graham's wrong to say that this is what he probably heard from Trump directly, is the minute they have the capacity to do it. So some scientists in North Korea figure out a way to miniaturize and make this missile work, and CIA intercepts or radio comm or whatever, and they get that message to the White House, and suddenly the birds are launching. I mean, that's a crazy dynamic, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And this is why, in this, I don't think actually, Trump spouts off, but I think the guy who really speaks for the administration on this issue of North Korea is Secretary of Defense Mattis. Tillerson to an extent, but Mattis has made it very clear that war is out of the question. And the thing is, the military is always going to ask, the Pentagon is always going to ask, okay, so you do a preemptive strike, what do you do then? What next? And then what next means, well, yeah, and then North Korea hits back, then you have a full-fledged war. What are you going to, it's like they know it would just escalate, very, very, very rapidly. And you'd have like a huge war going on in Asia, and I think that the Pentagon does not want that. I mean, the last time I was one of the only journalists to really report this until actually a former Secretary of Defense Gates wrote about it in his book. But in 2012. There was almost a war when South Korea and there was this, the North Koreans had sent some shells to this island in South Korea, and South Korea responded, and there was this period of a few hours where it looked like South Korea was going to shoot back all these missiles, and suddenly in the Pentagon, number 2 guy at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, James Cartwright. He made a statement to the press room in the Pentagon, and he said, well, we're really concerned that this could escalate, and we basically said we don't want any kind of counter response to the North Koreans. And in the next couple hours, people were watching South Korea, nothing happened, and then suddenly South Korea said they're canceling responding because of rain, but it was a cover story. They stopped it, and then I figured this out by looking at his statement and what was going on almost on a minute by minute basis. At the time, I was tweeting about it actually, and I said, what Cartwright just said means there's not going to be a war. Don't worry about it, because people kept asking me, is there going to be a war? And then Gates came out in his book and said that's actually what happened. The U.S. basically told South Korea to stand down, and we don't think of our military as doves in any manner, because they're not. But the fact is that in this situation, they backed South Korea from retaliating, and I think that the Pentagon, knowing now what would happen if the U.S. did a preemptive strike or anything like that, they know that it would just escalate totally out of control. So, I just think that's.
But if they get an order from the president, don't they have to do it?
Well, I don't. I think Trump is. I mean, I can't tell you what's in Trump's head, but I think that, he's not going to launch an attack unless he has the support of his military, and because he seems to listen to these generals pretty closely. But I mean, I think that the fact is, the U.S. Look, I don't know where Lindsey Graham is at in terms of his mentality, but the thing is, if you have an enemy that can, shoot a missile at you, it makes sense to talk to them and to see what can be done to defuse the situation, and so we don't get to a point of a war, because they would not launch any kind of. They know and lots of people say this, if they ever attack the U.S. or attack South Korea or attack Japan without provocation, that they'd be wiped out. There'd be nothing left. So they're not suicidal. They're not going to do that. And so I think they're developing these weapons because they fear the United States, and they look at Libya. I mean, even like the CIA director even said this the other day. He's talking about, they looked at Libya, they looked at Iraq, countries that, defang themselves. They know that. Yeah. So they're, I think that there's no question that, that this idea that they're getting ready to attack the United States is ludicrous. And one of the other things that's so ludicrous about the press coverage and people like Lindsey Graham, it's like the United States is some kind of, we're just this observer and create innocent bystander. We have nothing to do with what's happened before. They just hate us for some strange reason because
they're crazy. They're crazy.
They're crazy people. They just hate us for our democracy or whatever. That's just insane. I mean, there's this history that they're part of, and they know the history of U.S. North Korean negotiations and how the U.S. has botched it, and how they've owned up to botching it themselves a few times. But they know what's going on, and they've been making these statements, as recently as 2016, saying they want they would talk about nuclear weapons and missiles if they can start talking about a peace treaty and a general agreement to, scale down, end the war, move to a peace treaty, and then start talking about ending the hostile policy and taking steps toward that. And I think that, there's talk now of okay, so I'm not even going to talk about playing the China card, because China is not going to force North Korea into anything. And North Korea will resist anything that's forced on them by China. The history of North Korea and China, their resistance to Chinese demands and so on is it's sort of even humorous to read sometimes, because they just tell the Chinese to fuck off a lot. And they don't
that's Juche too, right? It's not just the West. Juche is for everybody but North Korea, right?
Yeah, they're not. It's like they're not going to be forced into anything by China. And this is the pretty much the consensus in Washington is let China do it. How can we force China? Now they're talking about doing all these sanctions on Chinese companies to really ratchet up the tension so they all do something about North Korea. But they're just not going to do it. Yesterday. Again, maybe it was Sunday, the last couple of days, the Chinese ambassador to the UN said, look, the principles here are the U.S. and North Korea, and they've got to talk. China's not going to be part of that. That's got to be resolved by those two parties. And, that's people in South Korea know this too. I spent the whole spring in South Korea, and, people in South Korea see this. And I think, pretty much a vast majority there see it this way, as a fight between North Korea and the U.S. I was there in April when there was these carrier groups steaming toward the Korean Peninsula, and everyone thought, Trump was going to launch a preemptive strike any hour. People in South Korea were, going about their business. No one was flocking to bomb shelters. Bomb shelters are ignored. No one thinks this war is going to happen, and they just see it as between North and the U.S. And they want 80% of the people in a recent poll are supportive of, Moon Jae-in's attempt to have bilateral South Korean, North Korean talks and moving toward, reopening the engagement that was shut off by his predecessors. And it's important to understand here that over the last 10 years, really, 8 to 9 years, there's been two very, very conservative presidents in South Korea So, you had Lee Myung-bak, and then you had Park Geun-hye. And, Park Geun-hye just got impeached. She's hated throughout South Korea. She was corrupt. But under her watch, things got really, really bad with North Korea. And things started to really getting bad under Lee Myung-bak before her. And that's one of the reasons that people were so happy to get rid of the conservative leaders there. And when I interviewed Moon Jae-in 2 days before his election for The Nation magazine, I was proud of this. I was one of only 2 foreign reporters he talked to during the election. The other one
that was a major deal, that interview, that you got it.
It was. And the other one was Anna Fitfield of the Washington Post. But he knew my work, that my reporting on Korea that I've done over the years, and told me he was grateful for my reporting, and that's why he talked to me. But he made it very clear when I was asking him, like, well, a lot of people in the U.S. say your policies are going to be in contrast to Trump, and people in the U.S. are going to disagree with you about your policies in terms of trying to have engagement with North Korea. And he said, well, Trump's been very critical of his predecessors and saying that they didn't get anything done with North Korea. Well, the same is true for my predecessors. He said, they really dropped the ball. They really failed. And he wants to, pick up where they failed and turn it around. And it's been very difficult for him in the last couple of months because, North Korea seems to be, I think North Korea does not want to talk to South Korea about its nuclear missiles and its standoff with the U.S. They want to talk to them about other things, but they keep, especially after the second test the other day, this ICBM test, South Korean president and his government have asked the U.S. for negotiations on, to allow South Korea to have longer range missiles and that kind of thing. So it's he's been responding in a kind of, hardline way to these recent tests, and it's making it much more complicated for him. But that is his plan, and they keep saying this even after these tests. They say, we want to continue this, try to extend the olive branch and to, pick up on the sunshine policies that Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, the president after Kim, were responsible for. And like, when you look at a timeline of U.S.-North Korea relations, things really can move when you have a progressive, pro-engagement president in South Korea. Like, for example, during the Bush administration, 2006, when they came back to talking to North Korea about its nuclear weapons, and they engaged in these 6-party talks, Roh Moo-hyun, who was the president, in 2007, went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il, and they had all these agreements about unification and ending the arms race. And so, there was a sort of, there was pressure from South Korea to engage with the U.S. And you have a progressive president who wants to engage, who's also doing the same thing with Trump. And so it's a very different situation when you have a super right-wing hawk in place in South Korea. And, last fall I was picking up, I was writing about this, how I would go to a forum at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the big military industrial complex think tank here. And the CEO of CSIS was like, oh, I'm really worried that the left is going to come to power in South Korea. They really don't like this sort of, engagement approach. And during the last progressive government of Roh Moo-hyun, they put an incredible amount of pressure on South Korean government, to curb their relationship with North Korea, not to engage too much and to push them away from peaceful negotiation.
Is there a simple reason why?
They want to have a hard line, maintain a hard line as hard line as possible. And I think actually, when Moon Jae-in was here meeting with Trump, their communique, Trump, they signed this communique, which came out very clearly in favor of South Korea engaging with North Korea. And, Moon Jae-in was very happy about that. One of the conservative presidents would not have bothered with it. That would not have been part of it. They just would have adopted this tough line. So these Moon Jae-in and Trump adopted in some of their language was very tough on North Korea in terms of like the need for sanctions and the need for pressure. But it also included this language about bilateral north-south engagement, and I think that the U.S. Trump. It's hard to overstate how much pressure these South Korean leaders can be under from the U.S. because the U.S. has a huge, enormous military presence there, and trade-wise, all kinds of ways the U.S. can pressure South Korea, and I actually wrote about that a little bit in this book on the U.S. empire that was published by WikiLeaks and Verso Press 2 or 3 years ago, where I had a chapter on East Asia. And the cables I got through WikiLeaks were from about 2008 to about 2011, all these cables that Chelsea Manning, leaked to WikiLeaks. Right. But they showed when Roh Moo-hyun left the presidency, and then Lee Myung-bak, who this right winger took over. You could see in these cables, the U.S. Bush administration and then the Obama administration were overjoyed that you had this right winger in power in South Korea, and the same thing in Japan. In Japan, you had for a while there was a period of time when it was this Democratic Party. It was sort of a liberal party was in power, and they wanted to change the agreement on Okinawa. U.S. Marines on Okinawa. And, the U.S., really put the pressure on them not to do that. And they finally came out with some, awful agreement that favored the U.S. And then the conservative LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, came back into power. And, the cables are just, the U.S. is just overjoyed. And, and you read, once the conservatives came back in Japan, Obama was in power, and you read, Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, and the secretaries and undersecretary of defense, they're all ecstatic that you have these right wingers in power because they're the ones who will support they're the ones who support the U.S., Japan, Korea, South Korean military alliance, and everything that goes along with that.
Yeah, doesn't that paint them into a corner right now? Because it looks like what you're saying. Is that basically the U.S. has blown these negotiations over a period of years. The Trump people and supporters in the Senate are saying they've got basically no other thing left to do but start a war. And the only people who might be able to talk us out of this are the South Koreans. So it seems like, they don't want to conduct good diplomacy, the U.S. government. And they also want the South Koreans to have these reactionaries who won't conduct diplomacy. So it seems like we've kind of been sabotaging ourselves if we're trying to talk our way out of a potential war.
Somebody's really trying to convince the world. I'm still not quite sure. Are they trying to convince the world and China that they're serious, that they might start a war, or are they trying to convince the American people? They're actually succeeding in that. Quite a few Americans believe that there is a great threat and that we might go to war. But, they're certainly trying to convince somebody that, no, even if it's crazy, I still might do it,
It's frightening that, there was this poll recently where, the majority of Americans said North Korea was a more dangerous foe than ISIS and posed a much greater danger than ISIS. What I tweeted was, the sheer power of propaganda. North Korea does not, except in a war, if we attack them, they would definitely be able to, kill a lot of Americans. If not through firing missiles here, they could at least, do a lot of damage in Japan and Korea, or Guam even, But I mean, the fact is that, war is not inevitable. And that I think the other thing is that since Trump came into office, I mean, it has been negotiating with the North. I mean, there was these talks that have been going on for some time, these Track 2 talks involving people like Lee Segal and Joel Witt, who used to be negotiated with Gallucci when they were negotiating the agreements back in the 90s. And other people have been part of these Track 2 talks where they just have these discussions with North Korea, and the North Koreans float ideas and the U.S. side floats ideas. Then they come back and the American delegates, talk to the Trump administration. Well, in February or so, who is the Trump administration negotiator for North Korea, the position is, negotiator on human rights, but he's the one who they sent. So he joined these talks. They were in Oslo, and he met with the deputy foreign minister of North Korea, a woman who's Madam Che. And she's been a consistent participant in U.S.-Korea talks for a few years, and is quite well trusted and known by the American side. Anyway, she met with Trump's representative, and it was apparently it was in those talks. Those talks were aimed at freeing at the time 4 Americans who were being held by North Korea, but with the hope that they would lead to other talks. And then it was after one of those meetings, actually the Trump representative met in New York with the North Korean ambassador to the UN. This was after they were discussing the return of some of these 4 prisoners. And it was at that time that the North Korean side said to the U.S. that this young man, Otto Warmbier, was in a coma.
Right, yeah.
Apparently, the way that some of the U.S. diplomats have put this to me is that in the U.S., like the FBI and the CIA sometimes never talk, or it used to be that, NSA would never talk to, law enforcement, this kind of thing. And after 9/11, they tried to bring all these agencies together, right? Well, in North Korea, which is a very authoritarian state, you can imagine that state security doesn't talk very much to the diplomatic corps. And in fact, state security is the one who's holding these prisoners. So probably what happened was the deputy foreign minister said, hey, look, we've reached an agreement with the Americans. We want to return one of them. And they said, by the way, sorry to tell you this, but he's in a coma. And so, the North Koreans deputy foreign minister immediately called an emergency meeting with the U.S. and said, here's the information. And, Ambassador Yu talked to Secretary of State Tillerson, who talked to Trump, and they said, go get him. And they sent him on a U.S. plane to Pyongyang, and he got this kid out, and he was in a coma, and he came back, and as we all know, he died, 4 or 5 days later. His family didn't want to do an autopsy, so it's not known, and there's never been any reports that he was actually, mistreated or tortured there.
Although Trump implied that. Trump implied he had been beaten to death, or been beaten to the point of dying later. It's
not. It's a terribly sad story, but the facts are facts. And when his doctors met the press before he died, they said there was no evidence of that kind of trauma, of being beaten or tortured in his body. Now, he could have been interrogated in a way that brought on, a heart attack and, oxygen loss to his brain or something like that. But nobody really knows. And the fact is, there was no autopsy done, so nobody knows what happened. But the fact is that Trump administration was talking to North Korea. And, one of these sessions, back to another mystery that happened a few months ago when Kim Jong-un's half-brother was assassinated in Malaysia at the airport by these women who had this poison on their hands that somehow didn't affect them. But anyway, nerve gas, VX gas, whatever.
Yeah, that's what I said, VX, yeah.
Yeah.
In an airport, right?
And it's at the airport. And there's still been very little. I mean, those women are going on trial, where North Korea has denied that they're the ones responsible. It's no conclusive proof has come out either way. But the fact is, after that happened, actually, the Trump administration had just provided visas to 3 senior-level North Koreans to come to New York. And when that happened, they were approved by Tillerson, the visas, and then it went up to the White House, and Bannon or somebody, pulled the plug on it, and then the visas were taken. The fact is that last Thursday there was a hearing at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and this woman from the State Department, it's the first State Department testimony on North Korea since Trump came in, and she made it clear that there's been no moves made to talk to them since Warmbier's death. And they asked her about negotiations. She said, well, the North Koreans know how to reach us. So it's sort of hanging on a thread right now. But I myself do not think that Madison, Tillerson, and McMaster, who I think are the 3 people that are really making the policy decisions on North Korea, I do not think they're going to let these negotiations just flounder. They're not going to. There's going to be some approach that they're going to make, because they have to know, they have to be able to talk to the North and say, okay, what are you willing to talk to us about? I mean, there has to be this kind of preliminary talk to get anywhere. And they, or do you want to go back to what you said last year about, they just have to be some kind of feeling out so they can at least test the freeze for freeze idea, North Korea freezing its missile tests and nuclear tests, and the U.S. freezing or scaling down its military exercises. That's the starting point for any negotiation. But if they keep insisting that they have to give up everything and surrender before they even talk, it's not going to go anywhere.
Makes sense.
Negotiations are, you can't just, it's like they're not in a position where they can just say unconditional surrender. And so
right.
What's going to happen there, I'm not sure. But I think that, Congress, they just think that by imposing more and more sanctions and, now upping the ante with China and pressuring China, that's going to do it. But I think that's foolish. If we want to, like Lindsey Graham says, we have to care about the homeland. I hate that word, but anyway, the homeland, well, if you want to protect American security and American lives, well, then, for God's sake, negotiate. Take them up on what they've said before. If they want to have a peace agreement, how could that be reached? I mean, if we're really concerned about peace, let's try to build a peace. That
makes sense to me, and it's a good point to, I guess, close it out on. As we're closing, we have the hour here.
Yeah.
Where should people look for your work, Tim? And I think you said you're working on another story coming up. I know there's a recent story you did for Low Blog. I know people can see your work in The Nation.
That was posted today on Low Blog. I write for The Nation. I'm doing this piece on the history of the U.S.-North Korean negotiations for The Nation. And it's as you can imagine, it's a really complicated story. I mean, it's
all learning.
It's like, and I tend to be a thorough reporter, and it's just like, oh my God, now it feels like the story that just won't, I can't finish because there's so many complexities to it, and I have to go back so far. But anyway, I write regularly for The Nation, and now I write for it's called the News Top of the Korea Center for Investigative Journalism, and I'm their first foreign correspondent, and they're well read in South Korea, and the articles, I'm posting them on Facebook and Twitter, but the articles are in Korean, of course, but they're at the bottom there's an English link to them. And
Good.
News Top, actually I posted one today. It had to do with 2 Americans who died recently that contributed a lot to Korea. So the News Top is going to start having an English language site, so it'll be easier to access my work there. But I'm still, the Nation is still a place you can read my stuff, and if you go on my page at the Nation, you can see like my last 2 or 3 years of reporting on this, because I've been reporting on South Korea, North Korea a lot for them.
Great. All right.
Anything else you want to say before we close out?
Well, I know a lot of people are interested in my work on privatization of intelligence and military, and I'm still, I'm starting to refocus on that because my book on that, Spies for Hire, came out it was finished 10 years ago, and I've been talking about doing another book for a long time, and I've certainly got the material for it.
This is the perfect time. Perfect time for it.
Yeah, 10 years later, I guess I can be thankful no one's really sort of moved into that space and is really reporting on it, on a regular basis. Although there are some good stories that come out on, privatized.
Fusion GPS, right?
Right. But anyway, so that's what I hope to do in the.
All right.
Anyway,
thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim. This is great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Really
I hope we can bring you back on this topic or the other topic. I'm super interested in both.
Okay.
Really appreciate it, Tim. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Tim Shorrock for giving us the interview. You can follow Tim's work at The Nation, News Tapa Korea Center for Investigative Reporting, timshorrock.com, SHORROCK.com, and follow Tim on Twitter at Timothy S. Like to support the show? Please do at patreon.com/aroundtheempire. For as little as $5 a month, helps us put on the show. You could also make a contribution via PayPal at aroundtheempire.com. We really appreciate it. Without your support, we can't do the show. Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Email Dan at aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire.com or our personal accounts at Dan S. Wright and at Joanne Leone. See you next time.
Take care.